Hi everyone. So today we are on module 4 unit 2 and this is the very last section of the course. In this section we are going to talk about fiscal and monetary policy. Now if you remember last time I told you that in the ADAS model I showed you the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap, and I said that the purpose of any policy, fiscal or monetary policy, is to bridge that gap, is to remove any kind of output gap. So the sole objective of fiscal or monetary policy is to remove any kind of output gap, be it recessionary or inflationary gap. Okay, so let's get started with fiscal policy. Now fiscal policy can be two types: the expansionary fiscal policy and the contractionary fiscal policy. Whenever the fiscal policy leads to an increase in real GDP, it is called an expansionary fiscal policy, and whenever it leads to a decrease in real GDP, it's called a contractionary fiscal policy. So you can understand from your knowledge of ADAS model, now that we have gone over the ADAS model, you know that we need to increase the real GDP when there is a recessionary gap in the economy, because a recessionary gap means that your actual real GDP is less than the potential, so your real GDP really needs to go up. So that means an expansionary fiscal policy needs to be followed when there is a recessionary gap in the economy. So it will take care of the recessionary gap whenever your actual real GDP is less than the potential real GDP. And I am not going into the details here, but you can go and look at module 4 unit 1 videos, the ADAS model, and you will exactly understand what we mean by the recessionary gap and why increasing the real GDP is necessary in a recessionary gap. Now coming to contractionary fiscal policy, in case of contractionary fiscal policy, it means that the real GDP decreases, and that means that kind of a policy would be appropriate whenever there is an inflationary gap. Because in case of an inflationary gap, you know that the actual real GDP is greater than the potential, so it is higher than the potential real GDP YP. And that is why it is necessary for the fiscal policy to reduce the real GDP so that it comes back to the potential, because the objective of every policy is to bring the economy back to the potential or back to the long run equilibrium. Now there are two tools of the fiscal policy. It operates through two tools. The two tools of the fiscal policy are taxes, which is denoted by capital T, and the government spending or government expenditure, which is denoted by capital G. So these are the two tools of fiscal policy. A fiscal policy can only work through these two tools. So you can understand that both these things are controlled by the government. The taxes are a source of earnings for the government, and the government spending is a source of spending or expenditure for the government. So basically the fiscal policy is executed through the two arms of the government's budget, because you know any budget consists of a spending side and an income side. So if you consider the budget of any government, then this is basically, the taxes are basically the earning side or the income side, and the government spending is basically the expenditure side. So that means the fiscal policy gets executed through the two arms of the budget of the government, or in other words, the fiscal policy really depends on the discretionary power of the government. Now when it comes to expansionary fiscal policy, the expansionary fiscal policy precisely refers to an increase in government spending So if government spending increases or the taxes decrease, then you have an expansionary fiscal policy. Because please note that whenever the G increases, then that will actually lead to an increase in real GDP, because your real GDP is given as C plus I plus G plus NX, right? So everything else staying the same, if there was an increase in G, then that would take the real GDP up, right? And that is exactly what we have said in case of expansionary fiscal policy. Now if the taxes go down, even then there would be an increase in real GDP, because if the taxes go down, then the way that it works in the economy is that due to a decrease in taxes, the consumption would be going up and hence the real GDP would be going up. Now why would the consumption go up if the taxes go down? Because think from the perspective of the households. When the household earns income, it has to pay taxes and it has to pay for its bills, and the leftover goes into savings. Now if the households are paying less in taxes, then they have more money disposable, they have more money left over, which could be used for consumption purposes, and hence if they have to pay lower taxes, then that would result in an increase in consumption, and everything else staying the same, that increase in consumption would be reflected through an increase in real GDP. Now the opposite would happen if government expenditure went down, or if the taxes went up. So that would account for a decrease in the real GDP. Both would take the real GDP down, and then that would account for contractionary fiscal policy, which is necessary in case of an inflationary gap. So now you know that an expansionary fiscal policy means an increase in government expenditure or decrease in taxes, and it will lead to an increase in the real GDP and bridge the recessionary gap of the economy. Whereas a contractionary fiscal policy is executed through a decrease in G or an increase in taxes such that the real GDP will decrease and the inflationary gap in the economy would be taken care of.